Generally, there's three kinds of unintentional killings at play. A death that occurs by defendant's ordinary negligence. There, defendant fell below the standard of care by engaging in behavior that put people at risk. That's tort law at work. The second is a more serious kind of behavior by defendant. Those are acts that expose others to substantial risk of death or serious bodily harm. These acts are deemed grossly negligent under the crime of involuntary manslaughter. And of course, tort law can be at play at the same time. Involuntary manslaughter is an unintentional killing committed without malice and with gross negligence. And finally, we sometimes see conduct that's so extremely reckless, it endangers human life. If we see this egregious behavior, it can satisfy the mens rea of malice for murder too. Even though defendant never intended to kill anyone, we would still have the mens rea of malice. We call this kind of murder too depraved heart murder for short. Many unintentional killings occur because of ordinary negligence, people just being careless. The criminal law doesn't need to get involved there. It relies solely on tort law to shape behavior and to send messages of deterrence. But sometimes our society feels compelled to punish when the behavior is unacceptable and when it exposes the public to a serious risk of harm or death, either with a charge of involuntary manslaughter under the mens rea of gross negligence, or in rare cases with a charge of murder too, because defendant was filled with callous and conscious disregard for the safety of others. Where to draw the line between what's ordinary negligence and gross negligence, or the line between gross negligence and depraved heart murder, is what our next series of lectures are all about. Unlike burglary that has clear-cut rules, this area of the law is decidedly gray. It's fact-intensive, and it involves public policy on how abhorrent we find the behavior and how we want to treat the unintentional killer. There is one factor at play that governs much of this line drawing. It's what I call, but for the grace of God go I. If it's behavior that everyone commonly does or messes up, juries are going to be less inclined to punish the defendant. Only if it's risky behavior in which juries don't engage will they be inclined to want to convict criminally. And this area of the law, perhaps more than any other, shapes our behavior by the messages it sends. The public is very aware of those unintentional deaths we criminalize and the ones we don't. And we actually end up changing behavior because of those messages. Here's an interesting example that we're currently experiencing. Should we criminalize the defendant who causes a fatality because of texting while driving? You know the situation. Hands aren't on the wheel. They're actually looking at the phone. Well, the answer may be clear to you now. You might be saying, well, of course. But even as recently as a few years ago, we considered this behavior just careless, only ordinary negligence. So why the change in our collective conscience? As it turns out, a few different events happened that brought the issue to the surface. First, across the country, we had a number of deaths from texting while driving, and in one case, texting while driving a train. The second was the proliferation of cell phones. So common a behavior of checking the phone while driving or texting or emailing while driving that we actually developed a new phrase for it. We call it distracted driving. To dramatically change behavior, the criminal law had to step in and punish it, to promote messages of blameworthiness, you were at fault for this death and we are going to punish you, and messages of deterrence to the rest of us when that person is punished. No longer would we call it ordinary negligence or carelessness and only grounds for a tort action. We were going to classify texting while driving as gross negligence, behavior that falls far below the standard of care. And if someone dies because of it, it's going to be involuntary manslaughter. Now, I should stop and say, while that's going on, there's also a tort action developing. So the family of that victim who died is able to sue the driver as well. But involuntary manslaughter is such a statement that alerts the public to the dangers of this behavior. Stop texting while driving, or you may suffer criminal consequences from it. In one of the first cases in the country, a 16-year-old is charged with involuntary manslaughter for the 2011 death resulting from her texting while driving. The prosecutor stated at the time, texting while driving is at least as dangerous as drinking and driving. We make that a crime. It should also be a crime for anybody to text while driving.